we have e4 and c6, the Caro-Kann Defense. Those names belong to Horatio Caro and Marcus Kann, who evaluated this line in the 1800s. Knight c3, d6. Not the usual way. The book move is d5, and then we answer that with d4 to transpose. After pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, you have the modern variation, or I mean the main line, and then the classical variation is bishop f5, knight g3, bishop g6, pawn h4, pawn h6, knight f3 is played here, knight d7 here. Boris Spassky's line is h5. Of course, Boris Spassky, as you may or may not know, was the 10th official world champion. Bishop h7, bishop d3, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop. I know this line pretty well. It's the line I used to play years ago before I adopted the line where I push the pawn up the f-file. e6, bishop d2 here, king's knight to f6, we queenside castle over here, bishop e7, king b1, kingside castles for black, knight e4 here. After knight takes knight and queen takes knight, knight comes to f6, hitting the queen. Queen drops to e2, queen to d5, bishop to e3, and those are your book moves. And the most common continuation is knight g4 here. Back, 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 back. None of that was played. Goldsmith with a very unusual d6. Bobby plays d4 anyway, knight d7, knight f3. But now that does give Goldsmith the opportunity to get back into a book line, and he does so with e5. And this transposes to Philidor's defense, Hannam's variation. Now, who are those guys? Philidor, Francois-André Donnegan Philidor, lived in the 1700s, 1726 to 1795. He was not only a musical composer, but he was a chess player, and he is widely regarded as the best chess player of his era, but also a composer of music. He contributed to the early development of the opera comique. Now, the Hannam variation of Philidor's defense is named for Major James Moore Hannam. He lived from 1840 to 1923. And not only was he a major in the Federal Army, the Northern Army, during the Civil War, but he was a chess master who played in quite a few American as well as international tournaments between 1884 and 1889. He's remembered today for several innovations in the opening, particularly this one. That line continues with bishop c4, which is Karl Schlechter's variation. Now, who was Karl Schlechter? He was a leading Austro-Hungarian chess master. He lived from 1874 to 1918, so he died relatively young. He was also a theoretician. Best known probably for his tied match, World Championship chess match against Emanuel Lasker. That match was tied, and Lasker retained his title. Pawn takes the E-man. Castles is the book move in Schlechter's variation. And then we continue with king's knight to f6, pawn to a4, castles, rook to e1, pawn to a5, pawn to h3, knight to b6, bishop to a2, king's knight to d7, an unusual looking move, bishop to e3, Pawn takes the pawn, and white has 3 different ways of capturing that pawn to continue the game. All 3 have been played throughout the history of chess. Let's go back now. Pawn takes the pawn on e5. And here knight takes the pawn. Better is to take with the d-man here. Knight takes the knight, pawn takes the knight, and now queen h5. Threatening the scholar's checkmate setup, although there is an escape square, but also attacking the e-man here. So Goldsmith cannot allow queen takes the pawn, and he doesn't want to play bishop e6, bishop takes bishop, and then this is pinned. So he has to play g6. Queen takes, hitting the rook, and he went with knight f6. More active would have been pawn f6. Bishop g5, super attacking the knight. Of course, the bishop is pinned, so the knight is not really defended, is it? He should probably castle here to break this pin. He tried bishop d7. You can see the eval bar lunges in white's favor. If he castles, we're going to play rook d1, and then you can play bishop d7. And at least you're still fighting-ish. Bishop d7. We queenside castles here. I'm not sure why he doesn't just take this bishop, this knight with his bishop. That hits the rook. The bishop can't take because it's pinned. I would have played this. And you got to move your rook. You can't take with the bishop. I would have played that, and then I would have castled. Bobby castling right away. So his opponent castles and gets out of the pin. Rook takes the bishop on d7. Queen takes d7, removing one of the defenders of the knight. I see. It's one thing Bobby was really good at, was simplifying in a winning position. I would have taken the knight. That's just clearly winning. But I think Bobby said, well, let's make it easy. I'll let you castle, but I will decoy one of your defenders away from the f6 defense. Now, if you play knight takes rook, I can queen takes the bishop. Queen takes the rook, bishop takes the knight, bishop takes the bishop, queen takes the bishop. And rook d1 is bound to come into play here with an attack on the queen. That's a strong winning move. Queen's rook to e8 was played here. He didn't play rook d1, he played pawn f3. I thought rook d1 should be played. I get a star. Pawn to f3, queen to c7, pawn to h4, queen to e5, queen takes queen, rook takes queen. You have an advantage, so you might as well simplify. Black playing right into Bobby's hands. Now rook d1 on the open file, rook to e7, rook to d6. Now king to g7, pawn to a3, pawn to f5, king to d2. Pawn takes the pawn, and knight takes the pawn. Rook f4, pawn h5, pawn takes pawn, rook d8. Pawn h4, rook g8 check, king h6, king e3, rook f5, rook g4, rook h5, king f2, rook g7, more simplification, rook takes rook, king takes rook, bishop f1, rook d5, bishop d3, pawn h6, king e3, rook h5, knight d6, pawn h3, pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn, knight takes pawn. Rook h5, pawn b4, rook e5 check, king f4, rook e7, knight d8, c5, pawn takes pawn, king f6, c6, rook c7, bishop e4. King e7, knight b7. King f6, knight d6, threatening the fork. Rook e7, pawn c7. And black resigned the game. Obviously, if you take, I've got the fork, and it's a bishop and knight against a king with one extra pawn to boot. And if you don't take the pawn, I promote. And you have no way of even coming here because that square's hot. So he resigned. Much cleaner game by Bobby Fischer there. He had an accuracy of 92.8.